En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur le réseau électrique. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. MEA is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
s'avérer
identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, squash separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Maya brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spores, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Maya is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors. Break the problems of micro-color difference
agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
Maya was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. Maya is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Meyer is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Meyer brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Meyer is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur le réseau électrique. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew
Recording
separation,
stopped.
whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spores, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. MEA is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Recording in progress.
Hello from wherever you are, and thank you for joining another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in both French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. This is also streamed live on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can ask your questions and leave your comments in the discussion box below. This webinar is also made possible because of the support from our partners and sponsors, to mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and cashewinformation.com. Before inviting Jim for today's session, please be reminded that the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place from November 18th to 22nd of this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. If you register now, you can enjoy 40% off all your conference rates. Let me introduce to you our award-winning consultant, business coach, and cashew specialist. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
Yeah, all good here.
Sure, we are with you for the session.
Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us wherever you are. Today, we're going to talk about markets, as always. We're going to talk about crops, and we're going to talk about tariffs. There's been a lot of discussion on these issues lately, and it seems to me that we're putting far too much focus on the rhetoric and not enough focus on the facts. So let's try and address that over the next hour or so. Don't forget, if you want to ask any questions, if you want to make any comments, please do so. Raise your hand and join us if you're on the Zoom call. Put a question or a comment into the chat. We love to see them all. And thanks to people who offer their comments and suggestions over the last 78 editions of the GME, believe it or not. So let's get going and let's have a look at markets and the market trends. So I'm going to go fairly light on this today. First of all, we'll have a look at what are the factors that are influencing the market. And I think when we focus on cashew kernels, and most of my focus today is on cashew kernels. When we look at cashew kernels, what we can see is that prices are still showing good resilience. Prices have not moved up, they've not moved down dramatically as might have been expected. So when we look at what's influencing prices to be lower and what's influencing prices to be higher, influencing lower prices would be continued prospect of good crops coming in the Northern Hemisphere. Economic uncertainty is always a big issue, and that's related to the uncertainty of trade as well. We're still looking at the impact of the price rises of last year on demand in this year, and of course a low level of forward sales. So that's causing processors to be a little bit more conservative, a little bit more reluctant when it comes to buying their raw cashew nut supplies. On the other hand, issues that are perhaps influencing prices to be higher, and you'll notice this week there's only 4, last time there were 6. The lower forward cover, which means people still have to buy. Raw cashew nut prices being high, so these are cost factors. High raw cashew nut prices means that kernels prices will struggle to drop any further. There are question marks over Cambodia, which are being answered, and question marks over India, which are more difficult to answer in terms of the size of the crop and the quality of the crop over the coming weeks. And of course, we have the problem that we've had now for quite a long time, more than 2 years, where there's pressure on processors' profit margins due to the high price of raw cashew nuts relative to the value of cashew kernels. And this has been a long problem. So where are these prices? Well, we'll have a look at 320s, and I just, rather than looking at long-term trends today, I just want to look at where have the adjustments come over the coming weeks. So I'm saying that Vietnamese FOB 320s are around $3.30. I don't take the cheapest, I don't take the dearest, I try and find some in-between number, and that's what I came up with. That is lower than it was 2 weeks ago by 5 to 10 cents. It's lower than it was a month ago, but only by 5 cents. And of course, it's much higher than it was a year ago, when during April of last year, the market was well below $3 a pound, as you know. What's also interesting is that African cashew kernels are maintaining their premium prices. Broadly speaking, people are asking between $3.55 and $3.60. That doesn't mean everyone. Some are making higher prices for various reasons, particularly good certification, sustainability certification. Others may be asking lower prices, particularly if they've got stock in the warehouse. Market's steady in Africa, west and east. It has drifted down a little bit, and of course it's much higher than it was this time last year. In fact, interestingly, the differential has widened. So African cashew kernels of good quality are relatively higher in price compared to Vietnamese cashew kernels than they were a year ago, which may be a signal. How do we look at it? Well, it's relatively quiet in terms of volume traded. That's not surprising. I do see some processors, particularly in Vietnam, getting a little bit nervous about where the market is and trying to understand what's happening, and that may cause them to drop their offers a little bit. Buyers, generally speaking, buyers remain reluctant. They'll buy what they need. They are, in general, delaying decision making insofar as they can within reasonable risk management parameters. And I think that they're unlikely to be convinced by lower prices. So I think for processors, particularly those that might feel a little bit nervous in this situation, if you drop your price, what you're actually going to do is chase the buyers away. And that is a phenomenon we saw in the second half of 2022 and early 2023, when the market headed right down to $2.45 FOB for WW320s. What about farm gate prices? And obviously during harvest time in West Africa, we need to look at farm gate prices. These prices are brought to us courtesy of the African Cashew Alliance's market report, AfriCashew Splits. This is a pretty good report. It's back out now for the new season, and I would recommend it to anyone. It's an interesting report because it's independent. And it's edited for independence. So unlike many publications, it's not just opinion, and it's not trying to influence the market. It's just giving it as we see it. Check it out. Farm prices in West Africa, well, I think the main feature that we can see is that minimum prices, particularly where those minimum prices were set rather high, are under pressure. So if we look in Cote d'Ivoire, $4.25 was the minimum price. That's about $720, depending on the exchange rate, of course. But it's difficult to maintain that price at the moment. The situation in Benin, something similar. The market price is being supported by, unfortunately, by illegal trade. But if you were to take that illegal trade away, then you would definitely see a sharp fall in farm gate prices. So generally speaking, farm gate prices at best are stable, but in most cases have been falling over the last time. Now also quality has been falling too, so we try to adjust the farm gate prices according to the available quality. In some countries, Cote d'Ivoire for example, as the season goes on and the areas harvested change, the quality tends to get a little bit lower. Looking at it now, what we see is minimum prices are under pressure, farm gate prices a little bit lower. Market prices generally are above the cost of production, in most cases well above the cost of production, so it makes sense for farmers this year particularly if they're getting higher yields, and higher yields will have a much bigger impact on farmers' profitability than higher prices. But it is getting a little bit tight in Burkina, for example, and in Benin. As it gets close to those minimum prices, margins for farmers start to get very tight. What do farmers do when margins get tight? Well, they stop putting inputs into their trees in the subsequent season. They stop planting new trees. And for many farmers, let's not forget that this is an important product. It's about supporting their livelihood, not just about making money, as it is in the trading area, for example. So this needs to be watched. And as the time goes on and as the market comes under pressure, farm gate prices are likely to come under pressure too. Staying with the subject of prices, let's ask, are these prices sustainable? And what I can say, looking at it from my point of view, is that yes, prices have been resilient so far, but there are now signs of weakness. Raw cashew nut prices remain above the kernel's equivalent. Logically, they should go down, except if kernels go up. Not sure if that's possible. Buyers of kernels are buying on opportunity. They do still need to take cover, but of course, as the year goes on, the level of cover they need to take, because they've bought, is reduced. And of course, as the year goes on, the pressure on buyers may well reduce. So you might see a situation once we get beyond June, which isn't that far away now, that buyers are very quiet in the market. These prices do work based on retail, based on wholesale prices in destination markets, but we still need to look at the impact of a possible economic downturn related to the uncertainty in the markets, related to rising costs, and that could impact demand. So in general, what I see is that the upside, i.e. the chances that prices could rise, as very limited, but that high costs, particularly of raw cashew nuts, particularly of export taxation in African countries, that these are supporting prices at the moment. But I also think that demand, at least in 2025, may be a little bit more resilient itself than is expected. Particularly this discussion around tariffs, as we'll discuss a little bit later. Just because you introduce tariffs doesn't necessarily mean that demand will crash. Let's go on and have a look at the crop situation and what we're hearing on that. I want to focus on two of the biggest players. First of all, Cambodia. So definitely we've reduced our estimates of the Cambodian crop over the last 2 weeks. Early in the season, you might remember that the Ministry of Agriculture in Cambodia was talking about a crop of around about 900,000 tons, significantly up on last year. 10% up on last year was mentioned. And I looked at that and I put in a crop of about 870,000 tons. We've revised that down. Why have we revised it down? We've revised it down because of the weather. And although arrivals have improved, although farm gate prices have fallen, when we look at the first quarter trade from Cambodia to Vietnam, it's down about 36%, and that's significant. Now, it's difficult to believe that that's just about a late crop. Having said that, I was talking to someone in Cambodia this morning who tells me that in their opinion, the crop will be much longer this year. It will go on into May, it may even go on into June, and that as that happens, therefore you will see a situation where much more is harvested than currently seems the case. So what we're seeing is a lot of different opinions from different parts of the country. We're seeing different views on the impact of the mixed weather conditions, rain in particular. And we should bear in mind that the overall crop estimates are poor at the moment. The system for estimating the crop is not good. But if we look around the areas and talk to people in the business, on the ground, so to speak, we are seeing some concerns. Needs to be watched carefully. I've marked down to about 820,000 tonnes. That's a little bit lower than last year, Last year was 850 according to the ministry, 840 according to others, but there's not a big difference in that. 818,000 tonnes was sold to Vietnam for processing. So that tends to indicate a crop. The crop estimate of last year was correct. This year, maybe a little bit conservative, but I'm thinking about it a little bit down. But it doesn't seem to be a crop of 2023. It doesn't seem to be a major fall in the crop. Time will tell. We need to watch it closely. India, well, the situation in India remains mixed, to say the least. The All India Cashew Association's initial estimates of the crop were a very good crop, 775 to 800,000 tonnes. The record crop is about 850,000 tonnes. Last year was probably 625 to 650,000 tonnes. So they were talking about a pretty good crop. I think the average is something like 717,000 tonnes. Well, when we look at the weather, we see that on the west coast, there were quite a lot of rains. Those are easing. Temperatures a little bit cooler. So key areas, the key states in the west coast would be Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Kerala. And as you can see, these produce about half the cashews grown in India, a little more than half the cashews grown in India. Question marks over those areas. On the east coast, there, according to the latest weather forecast, there's less rainfall than might be normal, and temperatures have been cooler than average. So some concerns. This is by no means clear. I would not be surprised if this estimate from the All India Cashew Association turned out to be correct, but it will depend on a number of weather factors in the coming weeks. So again, this needs to be watched, and there are some concerns about the Indian crop again this year, but it's not, by anyone's estimation, as bad a crop as it was last year. What about Africa? So we'll have a quick run around the countries, and this is a very snapshot, so bear that in mind. If you're interested in further more detail on the African crop situation, don't forget African Cashew Alliance, AfriCashew Splits magazine is available. Nigeria, what am I hearing? I'm hearing good quality. I'm hearing an estimate of about 350,000 tonnes, which I guess includes some of the material that comes across the border from Benin. There are discussions mainly coming from traders, some concerns on the second crop. People mentioned that to me this week. I haven't seen that. I've seen one or two people mention it, but generally speaking, I'm not seeing this as fact. I think it's more or less localized opinion. The area for harvesting cashews in Nigeria is quite big. Again, needs to be watched carefully, but we are well advanced in the Nigerian crop at this stage. I don't think there's any major concerns there. Benin, again, as is typical in our business, that the range of estimates, depending on who you talk to, is very wide. I've heard 180,000 tonnes up to as high as 225. I think the official estimate is around about 220,000 tonnes. It is a good crop. There's a lot of cross-border smuggling this year. The material, due to the ban on the export of raw cashew nuts. I suppose we can say two things. Firstly, there's smuggling because raw cashew nuts export is banned, and secondly, there's smuggling because processing volume is not enough in the country to absorb the whole crop. So you could say, without the smuggling, the farm gate price would crash, farmers would reduce their production. On the other hand, you could say that if the farm gate prices were as they are and smuggling was banned, processors would be forced to pay the minimum price. It's an interesting one, and it's something that is going to take some time to resolve. Moving on to Ghana. Okay, we're well toward the end of the season in Ghana. We've got the second crop coming. It is probably a little bit smaller, but it is a small element of the entire crop. Anyway, shipments very good. Shipments from Ghana very strong at the moment, what's physically available and gone. Market generally not too exciting. Prices down around the the minimum guide price from the Tree Crops Development Authority of 15 cedis are $960. Togo, small market, prices steady. Togo has assumed a great importance now because of the flow of raw material in from Benin and because of some developments in processing there. Exports started, so you should start to see some shipments from there very soon. Côte d'Ivoire, the biggest producer in the world. The crop is progressing. The crop, as the season goes on, the crop starts around about the center of the country and tends to move north. Prices now, in some areas, are discussed below the minimum levels. Now, I'm not saying people are paying below the minimum levels, but I'm certainly saying that there's pressure to bring it below the minimum levels. The official crop estimate is for a good crop, 1.2 million tons. But the more I look at it, the more I think it's bigger than that. And I would not be surprised to see a crop 1.35, 1.4 million tons this year. Early on, really excellent crop. Second, and now the third crop coming in, the usual concerns. We need to be careful when we listen to some of the gossip in the market. People are often more concerned with selling and influencing prices than they are with reflecting the reality. Meantime, the CCA is the regulatory body in Côte d'Ivoire, powerful because it's a highly regulated sector. They've taken a loan of some $50 million to finance, I think it's to finance raw material that would support processors and farm gate prices. On the processing side, quite interesting, I saw this week a report, I think it was in Cashew Week, saying that processing would reach 500,000 tons this year. That would be remarkable. It would also be very surprising. We think processing will be around about 400,000 tons plus this year. I don't think you're going to get as many Burma kernels traded because of the uncertainty on trade in Vietnam. And as we'll see shortly, we'll see the initial European Union trade figures with Côte d'Ivoire and elsewhere in Africa. Guinea still looks good, not much of a change from 2 weeks ago. Looks like a good crop. Things are progressing. Burkina Faso, I'm a bit surprised what's gone on in Burkina Faso. They have suspended exports. So the situation as it stands is that the official estimate of the crop is that it would be 220,000 tons. Very difficult to justify that figure. If we look at trade exports last year, I think about 109,000 tons, and processing in the country last year, definitely less than 20,000 tons. It's very hard to see where the 220,000 ton figure comes from. It's even more difficult for me, and this is very much a personal opinion, to see the logic behind suspending exports. If you've got a minimum price set, if you've got a deficit in processing, we're looking at maybe 10% of the crop being processed. The only thing that suspending exports is going to do is crash farm gate prices. Why would you want to do that in a country where you're only processing about 10% of the crop? It doesn't make sense to me. But if you know why it makes sense, please let me know. Moving on to Guinea-Bissau, crop still looks good according to reports. Senegal, similar situation. Guinea-Bissau looks like they've got the approach in terms of export management right again. Costs will be a little bit higher this year, but not too much. Somebody said to me about $30 a ton higher on costs. Freight might be lower, so that might be easily made up for that. Big picture, Africa still looks pretty good. Of course, there are some doubts here and there. There's doubts from Nigeria. There's a few question marks over what might be happening on the second crop in Ghana. Will this make a huge difference to the overall harvest? I don't think so. I think this is going to be a good crop. There's plentiful supply of raw cashew nuts. Farm gate prices, as we've seen, under pressure, but not too bad. Most areas farmers can still make a reasonable price, especially if they're getting a higher yield. Let's step back, have a look at the big picture now on production. And again, based on a reduction in the Cambodian crop, based on a reduction in the Indian crop. Now, when I say reduction, I mean on our earlier estimates. I'm not saying the crop is lower than last year. Based on those two questions, we've backtracked our estimates a little bit. We reduced, it's only by 1%, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was another couple of percent off that in the next 2 weeks. Still a good crop. I mean, if we see a crop of 5.76 million tonnes, that is a record crop. Still thinking worst case, same as 2023. Best case, record crop still in this situation. The questions over Cambodia and less, but still some questions over India, still in the air. So overall on production, generally favourable weather with some isolated problems. For example, parts of Cambodia, parts of India. Mixed reports from Cambodia. West Africa still looks good to me. India, the early indicators were good. The crop is coming in. Prices seem to reflect a good crop, but there are questions on weather and growing conditions around the country. Still thinking a minimum crop around 2023. Our estimates, some of them have got a little bit lower in the last 2 weeks. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens again, but there's still some margin, still a decent crop, in my opinion. That's markets and production. Let's have a look at trade. So the trade figures give us a lot of indicators as to where the market will go next. They can give us indicators of where we are in terms of demand and what are the factors that are impacting demand. So let's have a look at some of these figures. I'm going to start with Vietnam. Vietnam is the key supplier of cashew kernels to the world. And we'll have a look at Vietnam's exports to key markets in the first quarter. So I'm going to compare 2023, 2024, 2025. And we look at the top 6 in Europe, China, the United States, and as an indicator of demand in West Asia, North Africa, we look at the UAE. First thing I think that jumps out at us is that shipments to all 4 markets from Vietnam are down on last year. But they're all better than they were in 2023. So when we look at this, we see marginal reduction of shipments to European top 6, but still way up on 2023. Significant reduction on early season shipments. Now, I would say when I look at China that March was becoming stronger. January and February were poor, but March was becoming stronger, so that might be an indicator. But if we look back to 2023, this surge in Chinese demand is remarkable and looks like being sustained. The US market opened really remarkably last year. January, March last year was off the charts. We'll have another look at it in a moment, but obviously it's going to be down. It's going to be down because 2024 was so strong. It's going to be down because of uncertainty. And if we look at the UAE, slight reduction. So that could be seasonality. When we compare export shipments this year to last year, we need to remember that we are comparing with an exceptional year. 2024 was a record year by all measures. So when we make those comparisons, we have to be careful and we need to add the context of the year before or maybe a longer term context. Why would exports be down? Well, prices are higher. Inventories hanging over from 2024, some of those deliberate, by the way, obviously they're higher too, and that will limit shipments. And there are a whole series of other factors, seasonality, availability, and so on. So looking at it, we see significant drop to China and the United States, which are probably 2 very price-sensitive markets. Much lower drop into Europe, and I would say that's quite encouraging, and a 10% drop into the UAE, which I don't think we can say is either here nor there because we've got to see that over a longer period before we can judge. I'd like to focus on the European Union first. So we look at the EU, we'll look at the US and just have a little consideration of where things are going. Imports of cashews in January-March 2025 to the European Union were up by 13%. That is pretty remarkable. 13% up on last year, the record year, 24% up on 2023. So there's a growth rate in this first quarter, which generally speaking is the quietest quarter. There's a growth rate over the last 4 years of 4.5% per annum in this quarter. If we look at the full year, the growth rate is 6.8%. So the first quarter is growing less quickly than the full year, but it is growing. And that is really quite interesting. I mean, especially when we consider that we're looking at higher prices, we're looking at delayed tenders from retailers. That's the way many of them buy in Europe. We're looking at high crop expectations, discouraging buyers from making early decisions. So I think we can conclude that demand in the European Union is not just about prices. There are other really strong factors at play, and that therefore these higher prices this year, it is a little early to make this conclusion, but it's an indicator that maybe the higher prices are not going to have as much effect in the European Union as they might have elsewhere. Let's temper that or balance that with a couple of points. First of all, we might still be working through some of the low price contracts, and people might have wanted to get those in early ahead of any change in price. So there will have been delayed contracts in the mid $2 range. Some of those might be coming through. And secondly, we haven't seen the impact of retail prices yet, retail price increases yet. But very positive news. What about Africa in the European Union? African cashew kernels imports to the European Union were up by 17% in the first quarter of 2025 compared to 2024. So they're up 17%, the total figure is up 13%, so African cashews have increased their share in the European market in this quarter. And it's risen now to 21%. Last year it was 20. Again, this is encouraging. Looking behind the number is important. And what we're seeing is that Côte d'Ivoire is up 43%. That's way ahead of the average, of course. Tanzania, although Tanzania is still a relatively small supplier, but Tanzania is up by 26%. Every other country, Mozambique, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, every other country is down. Some are significantly down. The range is from 1% down to 78% down in the first quarter. Mozambique is down 78%. So this share of the market is increasingly concentrating on Côte d'Ivoire. We need to bear that in mind when we look at the future of African processing. Now, it can be maybe easily explained. These January, February, March arrivals were goods processed November, December, maybe a little bit of January. So you might have had a situation where factories were scaling down toward the end of the year. Time will tell. But there's a little bit of a warning signal there, I think, for the overall health of processing in Africa. Let's look at the US market. US imports down 16% in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the same period of 2024. It's actually the lowest first quarter imports since 2016 when we look at natural cashew kernels. So this is what we know as WW320s, SWs, 240s, and so on. Tariff heading 080132, basic cashew kernels. On the other hand, if we look at processed, and this is the main tariff heading that the processed come in under, now the volumes are nowhere near. I mean, the volume, 8,276 tons of processed cashews were imported compared to a figure of, what are we looking at, 21,000 tons of natural cashew kernels. But processed are up by 35% in January, February. So we are seeing something of a balancing effect here. Again, shipments from Africa were down by 17%, and Africa's share is stable around about 7%. It's a little bit, it is slightly down on last year, but not by very much. Overall, if we combine the processed imports and the natural cashew kernels imports, the combined is down by 6%. By the way, it's January, February. I said January, February, March. I don't have the March figures for the US just yet. So looking at it, I would say that it's actually quite a creditable performance so far, because we're looking at obviously high prices, we're looking at uncertainty, we're looking at, to a certain degree, January, February, those contracts would have been done long before that. So the economic discussion, the potential recession, wouldn't have impacted those figures. But so far, it would appear that the higher prices have definitely influenced exports from Vietnam, but not so much imports. That means that we can expect imports to the US to turn down during March, April, and May. Another good indicator is Vietnam's imports of raw cashew nuts. So if we look at the imports of raw cashew nuts month by month, what we're seeing again is that January, March is down on last year, which was, a good year, but not the record, and down on 2023, which was the record, 2.78 million tons. So March shipments were down 19% on last year. January, March shipments were down significantly, 32% on last year. And big time down in March, of course, the 19%, when January and February were quite good. To put a bit of context on it, don't forget that 2023 was the record year, 2.78 million tons. Last year was a little bit less, 2.49. So this down from last year might be more indicative of something of a downturn. So it's down about 125,000 tons. That's about 27,000 tons of kernels. It's less than a month's processing in Vietnam. If we look at the arrivals by the main suppliers, so I always look at Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana because it's quite early, Indonesia because it's Southern Hemisphere crop, Nigeria, again because it's early, in Tanzania. So it would look that, generally speaking, the arrivals from West Africa, although they are small in the first quarter in any situation, they're pretty much well down this year. The imports from Tanzania are double. That's interesting. So Vietnamese processors have clearly done what they said they were going to do. They said they're going to concentrate on origins other than West Africa to begin with, and they've done that. They've bought significantly in Tanzania and the significant imports. Now, whether they're reaching processors or whether they're in warehouses waiting to be sold, we don't know at this point. Imports from West Africa well down, 66%, but that's only 35,000 tons. We'll need to come back and have a look in April and May when we'd expect more shipments from the 2025 crop. Cambodia really is the reason why Vietnam's imports are down. January to March, imports down 36%, as I mentioned. That's 165,000 tons approximately. So it's similar to 2023, but well down on last year. And this is feeding into the conclusion that perhaps the Cambodian crop, well, it's certainly late, but is it lower? So we're looking at a situation where there's a lot of questions about Cambodia. Now, from a Vietnamese processor's point of view, being late is not really a big problem. In fact, the crop being late and coming slower actually means a relief on cash flow. So it's not a major issue for Vietnamese processors. The major issue is if it doesn't come at all. So we would need in April shipments to catch up. We'd need shipments of 400,000 tons, about 14,000 tons a day. Seems highly unlikely to happen. There's no real indication that that is happening. So I'm more drawn from these figures back toward the conclusion that this is telling us something about the Cambodian crop of 2025. But let's be clear. What we're saying is it's maybe not as good as last year. We're not saying it's by any means problematic. We're not saying by any means that it's a very low crop. We're saying it's a good crop. It's just not going to reach the initial forecasts. What about exports from Vietnam? Well, if we look at the cashew kernels exports in March, we see a pretty healthy year. I mean, it's the second highest in history. But they're still down by 5% on last year, which again, we are comparing with an exceptional year. Up 12% on 2023, up 40% on 2022. By any measure, these are figures that we could only have dreamed of a few years ago. If we look at the January-March situation, we see that, yeah, export shipments are down by 19%, but still way ahead of 2022 or 2023. Again, comparing to an exceptional year makes things look a little bit less positive than they are in reality. So exports continue quite strong. Time will tell if that continues, of course. Where does that leave Vietnam, its general situation? So we've imports down by 125,000 tons of RCN, exports down by about the same equivalent. I use 22% to convert. That's your average yield, less processing, outturn losses, gets me to about 22%. It might be right, it might be slightly right, slightly wrong. Doesn't matter. About the same figure for exports and imports. We lower opening stocks than in 2024. I'm not saying that the stocks were too low. I'm just saying that 2023 we had higher level of stocks. 2022 we had higher level of stocks again. This means that the situation is a little bit more balanced. There are fewer forward sales this year for all of those reasons that we've been chatting about. Still, we have this problem. International raw cashew nut prices are out of line with kernels. And we've got the uncertainty of the tariff regime. So the shock of 46% tariffs for Vietnamese processors is obviously going to create a great deal of uncertainty. We're going to talk about that in a little while too. So looking overall, exports down, 2024 an exceptional year, prices are up by more than 30%, buyers continue to wait to see the crop trends. There is a question on, in terms of the next step of market prices on kernels. A couple of questions. Are processors likely to chase forward sales? They could. There are some signs that they might. Would it be a good idea? Personally, I don't think so. I think buyers will just back off. There's no point in chasing sales if buyers are reluctant. Anyway, I don't think lower prices will do anything other than encourage them to reduce their own price ideas. But there is a chance that processors will chase forward sales. Will US buyers renegotiate? Will they delay shipments? For me, that's quite likely. There's two questions here. If you think the 10% tariffs might be removed, you might want to delay. If you think that 46% will eventually be the level, which is unlikely, but if you think that's going to be the level, then you'd want to accelerate. Will US buyers renegotiate? Of course they will, because don't forget, last year there was a lot of renegotiation on contracts as prices rose. So in the world of cashews, the tit for tat, you default this year, I'll default next year, will continue, and we will get continued renegotiation of contracts, creating greater uncertainty. So right now, Vietnam, I would say, is not in a bad position. They don't have full warehouses. They don't have full forward sales books either, unfortunately. But they're not in a threatened position. The only thing that's threatening Vietnamese cashew processing would be the long-term implementation of that outrageous 46% import tariff. What about India? Well, again, 2024, very strong imports. You can see that the final number, 1.2 million tonnes. It may have been slightly lower. The figures are unclear from the various organisations in India, but it was a very good year for imports. The January, February figures, again, we don't have March yet from India. Imports of RCN were down 28% in January. What's in India from Tanzania is high-priced inventory. I mean, we're looking at prices possibly in the region of $1,700 to $1,800 a tonne. We see demand is steady. April, May is not necessarily a very strong period for demand anyway. We're looking at high prices for competing nuts. That's the flip side of tariffs, of course. High-priced imports, but almonds and pistachio are looking quite strong anyway. That should push people toward cashews. And we've seen the Indian rupee, which had been quite strong and had spiked dramatically. We're now seeing some of that strength fading away. So that could reduce India's strength in terms of import. For me, Indian buyers should be coming to the market soon. They're probably looking at their own crop to see what the situation is. They may be concerned, just like Vietnamese processors, that raw cashew nut prices are a little bit on the high side. They are in a better position because their domestic market can hold that. But of course, there will be concern that impact on trade, although let's say that India was early in negotiating on trade. India did a really good job on trade. I was in India in February. The Prime Minister Modi was in Washington at that time and seems to have cut a deal which looks pretty good for India in the current circumstances. And time will tell as this current storm abates. So overall, in the trade indicators, I think there's a hangover from a really remarkable year. Be careful when making comparisons. Higher market prices, we're about 30% up on last year. It's impacting price-sensitive markets. That's China, West Asia, North Africa, it's the United States. It's everywhere, but some markets are more price-sensitive than others. European Union still looks positive on trade. The RCN trade is impacted by the uncertainty on kernels. The numbers that we're currently looking at do not reflect the trade tariffs, if those come to pass in the United States. Now, we're going to talk about trade tariffs, and you could talk about them all day and all night, but we need to get down to some facts on these things. But right now, what's changed is the sentiment in the market, but the fact in the market has not changed because those trade tariffs have not yet had time to influence actual trade. Buyers still, and I'm talking kernels, maybe also on raw cashew nuts, buyers still have reason to delay, but that could backfire. If you're a kernels buyer in the United States and you delay and the higher tariffs come in, obviously that backfires. If the higher tariffs don't come in and you've delayed, maybe the market bounces back a little bit. I'm really finding it difficult to be optimistic on the prices for raw cashew nuts. When I say optimistic, I mean that they will go up. I just can't see that. I think that they should come down. I think kernels are certainly not going up, and they may drift down a little bit in the coming weeks. So the trade indicators are telling us that the situation is actually pretty much as you would have expected, but there is a great deal of uncertainty introduced by the current political negotiations, machinations, whatever you like to call them. So let's have a look at some of those factors, and let's have a look at cashews and trade tariffs and the impact on the cashew business. First thing we need to say is that taxes on trade are not new in the cashew business. If we look at India effectively closed the largest kernels market in the world by restrictive tariffs, and that was done to protect a large number of jobs in domestic processing in India. The result was higher prices of kernels in India. The result was not a crash in demand. The result was higher prices in India, and India's demand continues to grow amongst the fastest growing markets in the world over the longer period. Secondly, African countries have taxed the export of raw cashew nuts for more than a decade, and some longer than that. Some have banned the export of raw cashew nuts, and that's been done either simply to raise revenue or in some cases to support the development of processing. It's rarely been done to support farmers, by the way, as you might have noticed, because these taxes tend to reduce the price at the farm gate. And finally, and there are others, but I'll just finally point to China. And as we know, China taxes the import of tree nuts in various ways, sales taxes, import tariffs, and so on. And that's to protect domestic food production. All of those decisions by those three huge markets are political decisions. And we come to another political decision, and that's what's new at the moment, is the imposition or the potential imposition of trade tariffs by a Western country, which uses an approach that seems to be threatening toward developing countries, as well as to its own economy. And that is something that is new experience in our business. But tariffs or taxes on trade are, generally speaking, not new. So when we look at that, and we look at the threat posed by tariffs to developing and particularly to fragile countries, it does seem beyond belief that high levels of tariffs are imposed on countries in Africa, which have no strategic threat to the United States. First thing I think we see is this is a negotiating position. I'm not the first person to say that, of course. But looking at various media, these are all US media channels, and a lot of it is about how this tariff regime fits in with the negotiation or a renegotiation of the whole situation with regard to America's position in the world economy. And much of this is for domestic consumption in the United States, of course. So let's look at the negotiation style. We're talking about a very competitive negotiation style, but that's about prioritizing your own interests, and it's about win-lose. So relationships tend not to matter. If you were, as a salesperson or as a trader, engaging in this kind of competitive negotiation style, you might find that you are burning bridges behind you as you cross, because there's no going back once you've created that kind of environment and that kind of hostility. But when you put out there and now we start to moderate this style of negotiation, you look at a competitive negotiation style, you make pretty aggressive, some would say outlandish demands and statements, and then you wait for the other party to respond. So you've now got them coming to you. You've got them coming to you from a position of apparent weakness because you've imposed these tariffs. You then step back from the aggressive demands, and we've seen signs of that, and then you redefine, the way I put it is you redefine what winning looks like. So initially, winning looks like restoring manufacturing in your own country. Never going to happen. So you just redefine what winning is. And winning is a deal. The deal is everything. And that's what we're beginning to see. So we've been seeing a certain amount of backtracking on things like smartphones, on computers. Are we going to see that continue? Well, I think it's highly likely that we will see a change of attitude toward food products, toward African countries, toward food products from Vietnam, for example. Only this week we have seen the fresh fruit and vegetable Association in Vietnam say that they think it's unlikely that these high levels of tariffs will be imposed on their products. And Vietnam is an important supplier of fresh fruit, fresh vegetables to the United States. But what do we do in the meantime? Well, let's first of all have a look and say, how important is the US market? And when we look at it, it is an important market. So North America as a whole is about 19% of world consumption. When we look at that, I take Canada and North America as one in this case, because a lot of the material that goes into Canada eventually ends up in the United States. So it's 19% of world consumption. But if we, as we probably should, take India out of that calculation, because as I've said, India is closed by its own tariffs, that would mean it's 29% of the overall demand in the open market, excluding India. Important share of kernels exports. So it's 25 to 29% of Vietnam's exports, depending on how you calculate it and which year you use. It's about 27% of Brazil's exports, only 7% of African exports, only 3% of Indian exports. So if we look at this and then we try and say, well, how much of that is actually RCN? So if I take out those US market and I say how much of the US market is impacting on the RCN market, it's about 500,000 tons of African RCN. So we're excluding Cambodia and Indonesian from that, and it's about 500,000 tons, and it could be a little bit lower depending on how you look at it. The US market has been growing very slowly. It's quite a mature market. If you take the annual growth up to 2023, it's only 1.9% per annum. So the future of cashew demand is not dependent on the US. The present, to a certain extent, is, but the future is not. So what we've seen in the last year is an unusual situation where US imports were well up. I think the other point is that in 2009, I had to look back at some of the old numbers, and I keep all the old numbers. I got numbers going back to the 80s. But if I went back to 2009, and in 2009, the US was 35% of world consumption. 2009 was 25%. 2000 was 35%. So 35% in 2000, 25% in 2009, something like 19% in 2024. So the importance of the US market in the overall cashew picture has been diminishing, but it's still an important market. Next question I'd ask is, what difference would tariffs make on cashew demand? I'm going to get into some numbers here. That's a warning. So if we look at tariffs are intended to make domestic products more competitive. That's not me saying that. That's economists saying that. And they are also paid by the importers or by the consumers. The importers pass the tariff on. They're rarely paid by the exporter. When we look at the difference that they would make, I thought, let's have a look at cashew prices. So let's take the market since April 2015. So this is about 10 years of the market. And then let's have a look over that period of time. If we added 10% onto today's prices, if we added 21%, that's the headline tariff number for Cote d'Ivoire, and 46%, which is the same figure for Vietnam. So when we put those in, the orange line is today's price plus 10%. The green one is today's price plus 21%, and the blue one is today's price plus 46%. First thing is, if we look at the orange line, plus 10%, well, it's not that much different to prices that we've seen over the longer period. Even at 21%, it's not hugely different. It's up around $4 a pound. And we have been there before, and we have seen markets survive those kind of prices. So when we look at then, we'd say, over the years, what was the impact of higher prices, say in this period, and lower prices in this period on demand growth in the US market. And so here we've got it. So what this means is, back in 2017, we had high prices and US demand grew by just under 5%. Now, those high prices didn't impact immediately. They impacted the following year, and you saw demand grew or contracted by 0.3%. That's 1/3 of 1%. And then you get a period of stable prices at slightly lower levels, and demand is pretty positive. So you can see when I mentioned earlier that the average growth is 1.9%, but you can also see that it's quite volatile. What really did make a difference, if we look back over it, was periods of recession and uncertainty. So in 2022, in the second half of the year, when the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine hit economies and costs and inflation, US basically stopped any growth in their cashew kernel buying. So what we're seeing is that price volatility, particularly at this level of 10%, hasn't made a huge difference to growth. If you get up 46%, and bear in mind, cashew prices have been more than 46% higher than they are today in the past, and the industry grew in that period and survived it. So the impact of these incredibly high prices, above $5 a pound, was no growth in the following year. It wasn't a crash, it wasn't a collapse, it was basically no growth in the following year. Beyond that, we saw growth returning as prices moderated. So my first thought would be that the potential recession that tariffs and economic uncertainty might bring could have a bigger impact than the actual tariffs themselves, especially if they're settled down at this 10% level. Now we're going to have a look at it differently. We're going to take the price of last year, and we're going to take the price of April 2024, which was for 320s, we recorded an average price of $2.60 per pound. Again, so April 2024 plus 10% actually puts us below today's market. Plus 21% is still below today's market and well below the average price over the period. It's only when we go up to this 46% level that we see that it has a huge impact. My point is that the industry survived a long period of low prices, 2022, 2023, into the early part of 2024, and came out stronger in 2024. Prices at destination could fall based on the necessity of tariffs. But even if they do, it seems to me that the prices for processors and for farmers at the farm gate will not fall below the levels that we have previously seen in 2023. So regardless of the outcome, and I'm still thinking a more positive outcome than many, I still think maximum 10% tariffs. I don't think this is going to have a huge impact. The only impact is for Vietnam if the 46% were enforced. So looking at this in the longer term, the way I'm thinking about it now is, let me go back because I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. In the long term, what we're saying is that about 19% of world demand could be damaged by tariffs. But tariffs of 10% would make little difference to demand. Tariffs of 21% would make some damage, but it wouldn't eliminate US demand growth completely because we've seen that before. Short-term impact, importers may try to negotiate. I'm talking about US importers. And definitely decision-making will be slowed down. So would US buyers switch to other nuts? Well, they didn't in the past. So when cashews were significantly higher than almonds, they didn't switch. There may be more competition from US grown pistachios, particularly if US grown pistachios are denied access to markets like China. So if we take into consideration that, on the one hand, the 46% tariff heading would have severely damaged the Vietnamese industry, but it's likely to be dropped. We've seen that Vietnam is negotiating with the United States. Vietnam has a $123 billion trade surplus with the United States. The United States is Vietnam's largest market for export, not just cashews, for export. But on the other hand, Vietnam is also in a position to address some of that and appears to have said that it will. So my guess is that 46% is just a negotiating position, unlikely to happen. And therefore, although there will be an impact in the US market by the tariffs, that they will be at 10%, and that won't make a huge difference. Key thing here would be, we've got long-term impact and short-term impact. Don't mix up the two when we're looking at our businesses. Don't make long-term decisions or long-term decisions that have long-term implications based on the short-term trends. It's really important to wait to see how this thing works out in the coming weeks. More important for me is the impact of a recession. The impact of a recession on the US market. We've seen back in 2022 what that did to demand in the second half of the year. So recession could have a big impact. And that for me is a much more likely result of the current situation. That will slow down buying, that could impact prices. But go back again and just remind ourselves, we're talking about 19% of world demand, 29% of market outside of India. So that's the level, the impact of pricing, the impact of potential recession on demand in the United States. Let's look at it a different way and let's consider, what about the difference in tariffs between countries? And just for a minute, although I'm not really a believer, but just for a minute, imagine that the 46% for Vietnam, the 26% for India, the 21% for Cote d'Ivoire is implemented. So this means a major loss of competitiveness for Vietnam. Now, ironically, Vietnam would be paying 46% duties on products which were grown in Africa. So is there a way that the actual origin of the product, the true origin of the product, is separated from the processing value added? It's just a question. In which case, would part of the value be at 10% and part be at 46%? We've been abusing rules of origin in the cashew business for 50 years. Are we going to regret the way that that's worked out? Look at India, 26% versus 46% would mean a gain in competitiveness. But I don't think, and I see a lot of social media stuff from India about how they're going to come back into the export market. But the domestic market, tariff costs, transport costs and tariffs, the 20% is very quickly eaten up. So really, I really don't see a huge gain in competitiveness for India in the export market. Still, the Indian domestic market is the best deal. But for Africa, a little bit different. So in Africa, we have Cote d'Ivoire is 21%. I guess that'll be short-lived. Other countries have between 10 and 14% tariffs. So it is a major gain in competitiveness from an African point of view versus Vietnam or versus India, particularly in an era of costs rising. So on the one hand, there is a major gain of competitiveness on kernels for African countries. But on the other hand, there is the problem that if Vietnam is disadvantaged, will Vietnam stop buying raw cashew nuts? Will the whole market contract in size? That seems unlikely. We've said that the tariffs will impact, at least the 46% tariffs, will impact about 500,000 tonnes of raw cashew nut demand. And I've deliberately made that figure quite high. You can make an argument that that is about 100,000 tonnes less too. So there is a prospect for African countries of improved competitiveness in the US market, but a loss of RCN business. And that's really important consideration. So the two factors. One is the impact overall of the introduction of tariffs on demand from the US. And secondly, the differentials in tariffs between countries. Those are two aspects. So how will that change buying? So you might see more American buyers start to look at African suppliers in the coming months. African suppliers only have a 7% share of the US market compared to a 20% share, 21% this year actually, of the European market. So perhaps that will get addressed. On the other hand, if American buyers remain really focused on price, then they're still unlikely to be able to talk to African processors who are currently making significant price premiums. Will this happen? So again, this is not the opinion of ACA, this is my opinion. I think it's unlikely that the retaliatory tariffs on foodstuffs will actually happen. Food only accounts for about 6% of US imports and 8% of US exports. But imports are significant. So they're significant for specialty products like coffee and cocoa, and very significant for fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. Now, if they were to exclude Mexico, the impact would be reduced. The 10% tariff would increase food prices by 3%. That's the average food price in American supermarkets by 3%. That's from Yale University's Budget Lab. Interesting organization. One of the election promises was to deal with inflation and rising food prices. Food prices in the US are up by 21% since 2021. That's mostly to do with energy and other costs. The US has no strategic interest in products like cashews, coffee, or cocoa. This whole tariff argument is not about food. It's about metals, it's about manufacturing, it's about smartphones, computers, cars. And US tree nut growers are 70% dependent on exports, especially on exports to two of their big targets for tariffs, India and China. In 2018, when tariffs were introduced on business with China, US tree nut growers were supported by the USDA. That facility is not there anymore. Those funds are not there anymore. So those tree nut growers would suffer. And indeed, if you look in the situation in California, with environmental and sustainability pressure on those growers, you've got to ask the question, would they completely disappear? On the other hand, exporting countries where the export of ingredients and commodities are important, they are prepared to negotiate. Vietnam with coffee, with cocoa, with spices, with fresh fruit and veg and so on. These are important to exports, and they are prepared to negotiate. So when I look at all of these factors, the impact on food, the very much upfront impact of going into to buy coffee and finding it's now $11 instead of $7, that kind of thing would have a huge impact politically as well as economically. It seems to me that the 10% tariff will be the end result of all of this on food. It seems to me, therefore, that the 10% tariff doesn't have a huge impact on the demand for cashew kernels in the United States. And that therefore, in time, provided processors hold their nerve, prices should stabilize, and we should get to a situation that some form of predictability is restored in the market. So there's a good chance that that damage will be limited, but this is a fluid situation. It's a political situation, and I'm basing this discussion on the logical and the best interest. And as we know, it doesn't always work that way. So we've talked about markets, we've talked about crops, we've talked about tariffs. Stella, have we got any questions or any interesting comments?
Yes, Jim, we do. Thank you for the presentation. Let me start here. Are there any studies or data available on farm level production cost in Africa?
There are studies done, whether some are published, we've done some ourselves, we have some background data on that. We've done a price comparison we did a price comparison on farm gate costs, farm gate production costs, or costs to the farm gate, if you like, when we worked with the EU-German CapSafe project in Cambodia. So we have a overall view of farm gate costs. I think there are individual studies, and I think that they are available, but they're not all published. And I think also some of them are a little bit old. So yeah, we're planning a session on farming and farming production on the 28th of May. We're going to have an interesting guest for that too, and I will introduce some of those topics during that session. Stella.
This question is quite long. Tariffs on Cote d'Ivoire and Vietnam have been reduced to flat 10%. Given the 10% across-the-board tariff by the US on India, Vietnam, and Africa, is it safe to say that it will result in a no imbalance in the share of cashew trade of the respective countries?
I do not think that a 10% tariff in the long run will have any major impact on the imports of cashew kernels into the United States. I think it's within the volatility parameters of our market anyway. We have seen prices in that range, and although it might have an initial impact, I don't think in the long run it'll have any big impact. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. We have another one. Why does the government of Benin ban raw cashew nut exports, even though local processing capacity cannot absorb the country's total production?
Well, I think that the objective of the government in Benin is to stimulate the growth of processing and to support investors who have invested in processing. And we know that the capacity to process has increased dramatically in the last few years with the GDIZ project. So therefore, the government seeks to develop processing. And I think the government is probably saying the long-term benefit of processing in our country is worth some difficult periods. Now, it would be very difficult, and it has been shown to be quite difficult, to have kind of interim measures. There are clearly interim measures where you give windows, where you take time, where you allow processors to buy, where you have different prices for processors than for others. We've seen systems elsewhere where there's tax breaks, even subsidies in Cote d'Ivoire. So you can see why the government would want to improve processing. Evidence is that development of processing tends to reward farmers better and more consistently than the RCN trade. Question, and the problem is, that if your processing capacity is, let's say, 120,000 tons, and your production capacity is, let's take the official estimate, 225,000 tons, where does the rest go? And the rest goes, as we know, across the border. So the blanket ban looks like it could be an effective measure if the processing is geared up to manage the whole crop. What's happening now is that farmers are relying on smugglers. Now, maybe they're not selling directly to smugglers, but farmers are relying on smugglers effectively to bring money into the system. So it does seem a questionable strategy to ban exports without full processing capacity. That's not to say that the motivation behind it is not positive, but it is to say that it doesn't work very well. At least it doesn't work very well in the first few years. Would investors still invest if there was no ban on RCN? Hard to say. Probably they wouldn't invest to the same scale that they have done. And bear in mind, it was expected that the GGIZ project would have a much larger processing capacity in gear last year and certainly this year than it has. So the government has set out on a road that has many twists and turns in it, and one of those is the difficulty of smuggling. So if the government effectively enforces the ban on export of RCN, the farm gate price will crash. But they've got a minimum price to protect against that. And they've a relatively low minimum price, which processors could easily work with. And there's the contradiction. You're still left with 80, 100,000 tons perhaps, with nowhere to go. So what would happen to that if there was no export of RCN and everyone respected the minimum price? That's a question I can't answer because it's illogical to do it. But we know why they did it, and we know that long term it could be beneficial. Short term, smuggling, I mean, that whole idea of smuggling changes the industry. It changes the way that the industry behaves. It introduces illegal behavior as normal. Anyone who buys RCN probably ends up with some smuggled material, whether they know it or not. It's a big question. Stella, thank you for that question, by the way. It's quite a stimulating one and something that we might address again in more detail. That was from Dauda Yao, I think. Thank you. Stella, back to you.
Yes, Jim, we have a follow-up question. What effect could a ban on raw walnuts have in Burkina Faso?
It could reduce farm gate prices. So it could reduce farm gate prices, allowing processors to process more product. That's on the positive side. It could lead to smuggling. It could lead to loss of quality because the warehousing facilities to store the product are not there. It could lead to poverty for farmers who are unable to sell their raw cashew nuts. It depends on how long it lasts, of course. But there is a contradiction in banning RCN when you A, don't have enough capacity to process it all, and you B, don't have enough capacity to enforce the minimum price regime, and you C, don't have enough warehousing in which to store the product. So it's a risky strategy. I think I can understand it. I think that if someone says we're banning raw cashew nuts export for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, I get that. I understand that. I think that's not a bad idea maybe. But if you say we're banning it and you don't give any idea as to when you're going to lift that ban, you don't allow business people to prepare, the buyers have left the country. Will they come back? Will their money come back? I don't know. And that's really risky. So this can have a really negative effect. And I would love to see the government say, yeah, we're doing that. We're banning the RCN and it's going to last another 3 to 4 weeks. And after that, then export will be free again. Great question, and thank you for that. Stella.
Yes, Jim. Could you also speak about West African demand and supply issues, crop size, especially with regards to Senegal, Mali, and the Gambia?
Well, I've spoken about most countries in West Africa already. What I understand from Senegal, the Gambia, and from Mali is that the crop looks pretty good. We're not going to see the same movement of product. I think product from Mali has been moving. Product from Senegal will move. The crop in Senegal is increasing. I think they're talking, well, some people are talking big numbers this year, 100,000 tons. I don't think so. But it looks like a good crop. It's high quality. There's very little processing there. The Gambia is a country that developed its cashew business based on operations of an efficient port at Banjul. There's very little processing. The nuts that are grown there are high quality and the production is increasing. I think in that area, generally, we're looking at good crops. And again, we will focus on that area when the crops start to come in. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. With all these unplanned policy changes that are coming in, will investors be keen to set up plants in Africa?
Yeah. Well, it can't do any good. If I'm an investor and I look at a situation where government policy is unpredictable, I am certainly going to be a little bit more reluctant in my approach. It's not so much what the exact policy is, it's that it becomes unpredictable and or unplanned, as Amit Pai, our questioner, describes it. So I would say that volatility in policy, particularly ad hoc volatility where you see introduction without warning of certain constraints, is unlikely to encourage investors. I think there are still compelling reasons to invest in processing in Africa, but maybe what will happen is that investors will start to look at those countries where they see more stability in policy as better locations for their business. But certainly in terms of the progress, in terms of demand for African cashew kernels, in terms of the quality, in terms of the premium prices being paid in African countries, it seems to me that it still is a very strong argument for investment in processing. It would not help if policy was to continue to be so volatile, and more than volatile, reactionary. So, you know, changing the regulatory system because of short-term market factors is never a good idea. It just creates uncertainty. And that is what discourages investors, is uncertainty. Interesting question. Thank you. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. What should we expect for the next GME?
Okay, so my outlook on the market is less certain than usual, let's say. Or I'm never certain, but less confident than usual, given the way things are. I think the way we're looking at it at the moment is, generally speaking, there's no real problem in the short term of supply and demand. I think kernels prices do look a touch weaker, and I mean a touch. Uncertainty will continue to delay decision making, both for buyers and for sellers. People will tend to reduce their level of forward cover. That's discouraging them from buying in the market. Crops continue to look good. Question marks on Cambodia and on India. We're going to have more on that the next time we talk at the GME in 2 weeks. The mismatch between raw cashew nuts and kernel prices is less than it was a year ago, but it's still a mismatch. Now, when I say a mismatch, what I mean is, can I go today and buy raw cashew nuts at today's market price, process them and sell them at the same time and write a profit into my books? I can't do that today from most origins, but it's different. It's a little bit less than it was 12 months ago. Overall, I would say patience is always a virtue, but it's especially a virtue in this current situation. And I would underline the fact that the way I'm looking at it is making long-term decisions, for example, to withdraw from investment based on short-term factors, can be a mistake. It can be damaging to the overall strategy. So next time we're going to talk about that. We've spoken recently about processing in Africa. We're going to talk about policy the next time. We're going to talk about the impact on the market of this continued uncertainty. And we're going to look a little bit more at trade and see also if we can get some positive reads on what's happened in Cambodia on the crop and what's happened in India. But for now, let me remind you that all of our GME are up on the African Cashews channel on YouTube. I'm sure this one will be up in the next 24 hours. If you're interested, you can go there and you can have a look at what interests you. Some of the videos are very long, but of course it's YouTube, so you can do whatever you want. You can look at part or none or in between or just at the end. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think we had a record attendance on Zoom today. I don't know where else, but that's great. And thanks to everyone who joins us. Thank you especially to people who've asked questions or added comments, and to all those that will follow. I'm getting a deluge of emails and WhatsApp messages after these sessions. You can see how you can contact me if you want to on the screen. Feel free to do that. I'll try and answer any questions or queries or to provide any information. And have a great time. Keep an eye on the market. Enjoy uncertainty. It's a challenge. Talk to you soon. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim. And I would also like to thank the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and cashewinformation.com. Before I leave you to the networking platform for the rest of the session, be reminded that the registration for the 19th AC Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is still ongoing. It will take place from 18 to 22nd of November this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The discount is still on for 40% until August 31st. Enjoy the rest of your day. We will see you on the 30th of April this month. Bye.
Bye-bye.